In the thick fog of the Ozark Mountains in 1964, James Harrington, a United States Forest Service ranger, was conducting a survey for the expansion of Mark Twain National Forest when he entered an unexplored area. His routine mission to map potential lands for federal acquisition would inadvertently uncover one of the most disturbing cases of family isolation and consanguinity ever documented in the state of Missouri. I was following the course of an unmapped stream when I noticed signs of human occupation, Harrington reported in his testimony to the Shannon County Department of Social Services, a document that remained sealed for nearly 3 decades after the incident. First, a rudimentary fence, then smoke rising through the trees, and finally a clearing with several structures that weren't on any official record. Without confrontation, Harrington managed to leave the property and immediately reported his discovery to county authorities. His training in biology had allowed him to recognize clear signs of genetic problems among the family members he had briefly observed, a pattern he correctly associated with possible consanguinity. It wasn't just a family living outside the system, Harrington explained in a 1990 interview for the Missouri Department of Conservation. It was a family that seemed to be physically deteriorating due to genetic isolation. As a public official, I felt I couldn't simply ignore it, even while respecting people's right to live as they choose. What the forest ranger found in that isolated clearing more than 30 kilometers from the nearest community defied any emotional preparation. An entire family, later identified as the Olaris, had been living completely isolated from the outside world for at least 4 generations. But it wasn't just the geographic isolation that made the case alarming, Harrington continued in his account. There were children with visible deformities, adults with almost identical facial features and their own language that I could barely understand. When I identified myself as a government employee, the older man just pointed a shotgun in my direction and said something like, "No stranger brings anything good." The Ozark Mountains, with their rugged topography and dense vegetation, have always harbored isolated communities, but the case of the Holloway family transcended typical American rural isolation. Subsequent investigations would reveal a closed family system where marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, and even between siblings had become the norm for more than 70 years. In 27 years of medicine in rural communities, I have never witnessed such a concentration of genetic anomalies in a single family group, wrote Dr. Robert Fielding, the first professional to examine some family members after the discovery, in his personal notes. Consanguinity here is not occasional, but systemic and multi-generational. Official county records consulted after the discovery showed only vague indications of the family's existence, a birth certificate from 1887 for one Jeremiah Holloway, some sparse mentions in early century censuses, and then nothing. It was as if the family had simply disappeared from the records, while in reality they were going deeper into the mountains and into their own isolation. Those children never attended schools. Some adults barely knew there had been a world war or who was president, reported social worker Mary Carpenter, who participated in the first interventions. But the most disturbing thing was how they saw their own situation as normal. For them, the outside world was the aberration. Local authorities soon found themselves facing an unprecedented ethical and legal dilemma. How to intervene in a family that had lived this way for generations? What would be the consequences of forced separation? And perhaps most importantly, how could such an extreme situation have remained invisible for so long in the mid-10th century? The answers to these questions would only begin to emerge when investigators managed to reconstruct the history of the Holloways, a saga dating back to the late 19th century that reveals as much about the geographic isolation of the Ozark Mountains as it does about the institutional failures that allowed an entire family to disappear from society's view. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Stories like the Holloways rarely reach public knowledge with all the original details preserved. You won't find this anywhere else. The history of the Holloways in the depths of the Ozark Mountains officially begins in 1881 when Jeremiah Holloway, then 22 years old, acquired 120 acres of remote land in what is now Shannon County, Missouri. Records from the time preserved in the State Historical Archive show that Jeremiah paid a negligible amount for the property, land considered of little value due to the rugged terrain and extremely difficult access. What the documents don't explain is the reason that led Jeremiah to seek such isolation. Interviews with elderly residents of neighboring communities conducted after the family's discovery in 1964 suggest that Jeremiah may have fled criminal charges in Kentucky. A letter found among the family's belongings, dated 1882, offers clues: "No one will find us here. We can live according to our own laws, away from the eyes of those who do not understand our way of life." Jeremiah didn't come alone. He brought his young wife Eliza, his younger sister Constance, and two male cousins, Isaiah and Thaddeus. This initial family configuration would be crucial to understanding what would happen in the following decades. The location chosen by Jeremiah to establish his property was strategically isolated even by the standards of the time. Situated in a narrow valley surrounded by steep elevations on all sides, access was only by a precarious trail that became impossible during the winter months. An extreme case of intentional geographic isolation, where every natural feature served as an additional barrier to external contact, is how geographer Dr. Wallace Humphrey, who studied the region in the 1970s, described the location. Between 1883 and 1890, parish records from the distant Pine Grove Baptist Church show that Jeremiah occasionally came down to the community to acquire essential supplies. Pastor Jonathan Miller, who kept a meticulous diary, described Jeremiah as a reserved and distrustful man who spoke little and never brought his family to Sunday gatherings despite repeated invitations. The last mention of a visit by Jeremiah to the community dates from April 1890. After that, the Holloways appear to have cut almost all contact with the outside world. Coincidentally, it was during this same period that the family's genetic isolation began to establish itself. Documents found on the property after the 1964 discovery revealed that around 1892, Jeremiah Holloway had formalized a union between his sister Constance and his cousin Isaiah. 2 years later, his own eldest daughter, then only 14 years old, was given in marriage to the other cousin Thaddeus, then 32 years old. A diary belonging to Eliza Holloway, Jeremiah's wife, offers a disturbing glimpse into the mentality that was beginning to form. Jeremiah says that pure blood must remain pure, that the families in the valley are weak because they mix their blood with strangers. "I pray that the Lord guides us, for I fear for the future of our children." By 1900, the Holloways had developed a small self-sufficient community. They grew corn, beans and potatoes on terraces on the slopes. They raised pigs and chickens. They hunted and fished in the nearby forests and streams. They built more cabins as the family grew, always staying within the boundaries of the original property. An official 1900 census briefly records the existence of approximately 15 individuals on the whole property, but the census taker noted that complete access to the dwellings was not permitted and that the head of the family demonstrated extreme hostility to government presence. It was probably the last time any official representative set foot on the property until the discovery in 1964. The Holloways' geographic isolation was reinforced by historical events. The Great Depression of 1929 economically devastated the region, causing many families to abandon their rural properties. The Ozark Mountains region, already sparsely populated, became even more deserted. During World War II, rationing and fuel restrictions further reduced traffic in remote areas. It was a period when many rural communities were forgotten by the authorities, explained local historian Timothy Warren in a 1970 article about the case. If a family was already living intentionally isolated, the combination of economic depression and war created the perfect environment for them to completely disappear from the records. And that's exactly what happened with the Holloways. As the decades passed, the family became more numerous, more endogamous, and more isolated. A rigid oral tradition replaced any formal education. A system of beliefs, mixing religious elements, superstitions, and justifications for consanguinity solidified through the generations. They believed the outside world was contaminated, revealed EMTT Holloway, one of the few members who managed to adapt to life outside the property after the 1964 intervention. Our elders taught that the family's blood was special, chosen, and that mixing it with strangers would bring disease and weakness. When James Harrington accidentally discovered the property in 1964, he didn't just find an isolated family. He found a social microcosm that had evolved separately for almost 8 decades with profound genetic and social consequences that were only beginning to be understood. When authorities finally gained complete access to the Holloway property in October 1964, after weeks of tense negotiations, what they found shocked even the most experienced professionals. The family had grown to about 42 individuals distributed across 3 living generations, all direct descendants of the 5 original members who settled on the property in the late 19th century. The degree of genetic homogeneity observed in the Holloway family represents one of the most extreme cases of prolonged consanguinity ever documented in modern medical literature, wrote Dr. Malcolm Harrison, a geneticist from the University of Missouri who was called as a consultant on the case, in a confidential report that would only become public in 1991. Virtually all members exhibit some degree of manifestation of deleterious recessive characters. The technical language of the report hid a disturbing reality. Among the 42 living members, 27 presented some type of physical or cognitive disability directly attributable to consanguinity. Fused fingers, synendactyly, severe facial deformities, congenital deafness, and various degrees of intellectual impairment were common, especially among the youngest, clear evidence of the progressive accumulation of recessive genetic mutations over generations. Martha Holloway, one of the older women in the group, born around 1910, provided investigators with details about the internal family structure. Her testimony, recorded on tapes that were later transcribed and archived at the Missouri State Library, reveals a complex system of arranged unions. When a girl bleeds for the first time, she is ready to marry, Martha explained with disconcerting naturalness. The Council of Elders decides who marries whom based on the family's strength lines. The full siblings don't marry each other, only half-siblings, because that was written in the rule book. The mentioned rule book was found in the main cabin, a leather-bound manuscript with over 200 pages handwritten over decades by different family members. The document combined distorted elements of biblical texts, practical rules for life on the property, and elaborate genealogical records that served to plan future unions, apparently in an attempt to minimize some specific types of consanguinity while encouraging others. An anthropologist who studied the manuscript commented that the document revealed an instinctive, albeit primitive, understanding of genetic risks combined with mystical justifications for practices that the outside community would consider incestuous. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Isolated ignorance can be the worst prison. Daily life on the Holloway property was marked by rigid routines and divisions of labor based on gender and physical ability. Children began working as soon as they could walk, initially assisting with household chores and progressing to heavier agricultural work as they grew. Formal education was non-existent, replaced by a system of practical learning and oral transmission of knowledge. Some older members knew how to read and write rudimentarily, skills transmitted from the founders, but many of the younger ones were completely illiterate. Their vocabulary was limited and mixed archaic English with unique expressions developed internally. They had their own words to describe medical concepts they empirically recognized, observed linguist Dr. Caroline Foster, who studied the family's dialect. Terms like weak blood and deep eyes were used to describe conditions we recognize as anemia and congenital microalmia. The family's diet, although sufficient in quantity, was nutritionally deficient based mainly on corn, beans, pork, and seasonal wild foods. The lack of access to medical care resulted in high rates of infant and maternal mortality. Of the graves found in the small family cemetery, almost 60% belonged to children who did not reach 5 years of age. Statistically significant is the fact that as generations advanced, the proportion of births with complications increased, as did the rate of early mortality, a classic pattern of inbreeding depression observed in populations with a high degree of consanguinity. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Holloway case was the normalization of deformities and disabilities within the community. For them, the family traits were not seen as pathological, but as distinctive marks of belonging. Sarah Holloway, a girl of just 12 when interviewed by social workers, expressed confusion when questioned about her younger brother, who had been born with severe malformations. "Why are you asking about Jacob? He's like that because he has strong family blood. The joined fingers show he's a true holo." This normalization combined with total isolation explains why no family member ever sought external help even in the most severe cases of illness or deformity. For them, the outside world represented a threat, not a source of assistance. The patriarch in 1964, Odiah Holloway, grandson of Jeremiah, maintained rigid control over any contact with the outside. Interviews with younger members revealed that he frequently told terrifying stories about what happened to family people who got lost in the world of strangers, narratives that clearly served to discourage escapes or seeking external contact. When authorities finally gained access to the property, they found a community that existed in almost complete self-sufficiency. They made their own clothes from cotton and wool. They built furniture and tools using methods dating back to the 19th century. They preserved food using salting and smoking techniques. They treated diseases and injuries with medicinal plants and practices that mixed empirical knowledge with superstition. It was like entering a time capsule, described Deputy Sheriff William Tanner, one of the first officers to enter the property. Except it wasn't just the way of life that seemed frozen in time. It was also the family's blood circulating and recirculating in the same closed group for generations. The discovery of the Holloway family in 1964 placed Missouri authorities before an unprecedented dilemma. The extent of isolation, the severity of health conditions, and the complex internal social system of the family required intervention, but the case raised deeply challenging legal, ethical, and practical questions. There was no protocol for a situation like this, Richard Donovan, then Shannon County prosecutor, admitted years later. "We were simultaneously dealing with possible child abuse, medical neglect, incest, but also with a community that had lived this way for decades with their own rules and with no apparent awareness of the illegality of their practices." The first phase of the intervention focused on emergency medical evaluations. A multidisciplinary team was assembled, including doctors, nurses, social workers, and legal representatives. In the first 72 hours after official access to the property, 8 critical medical cases requiring immediate hospitalization were identified, mainly children with severe congenital conditions who had never received adequate treatment. West Plains Regional Hospital, the closest with capacity to handle complex cases, improvised a special ward to receive family members. "We are treating conditions that we would normally only see in textbooks," reported Dr. Elenina Simmons, medical director at the time, in an internal memo. "Some of these children present anomalies so rare that our specialists had to consult medical literature to correctly identify them." One of the most emblematic cases was that of Timothy Holloway, a 7-year-old boy with advanced cranioanostosis, premature fusion of the skull bones that caused dangerous intracranial pressure and progressive visual impairment. The condition, treatable if diagnosed early, had reached a critical stage. Timothy underwent emergency surgery which according to medical records most likely saved his life but too late to reverse all neurological damage. While the medical team dealt with the most urgent cases, judicial authorities faced complex legal issues. Consanguinity was clearly illegal under Missouri law. but the marriages had occurred informally without official records. Many family members didn't even have birth certificates or any legal documentation. Judge Howard Brennan, assigned to oversee the case, initially opted for a cautious approach. Instead of immediate criminal charges against the adults, he issued temporary protection orders for all minors and ordered comprehensive psychological evaluations before any decision on permanent custody. "We are dealing with people who in many ways do not understand our legal or social system," the judge wrote in his preliminary decision. "Before we apply the full force of the law, we need to determine the degree of capacity for moral discernment within this extremely isolated context." This approach was not without criticism. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a scathing editorial questioning, "For how long did our society tolerate this abuse in the name of rural isolation? And now are we again failing these children by not holding the perpetrators accountable?" The separation of the family generated resistance. The older members, led by Obadiah O'Leary, initially refused to cooperate with any intervention. The continuous presence of sheriff's officers on the property was necessary for several weeks. Even so, 3 teenagers escaped from state custody and tried to return to the family property, demonstrating the strong bond they maintained with their way of life despite the objectively precarious conditions. The psychological evaluation of adult members revealed consistent patterns. "We observed a combination of cognitive limitations resulting from both genetic factors and severe educational deprivation associated with a rigid and isolated belief system that normalizes practices that mainstream society considers abusive," reported Dr. Harold Freeman, a psychiatrist who led the evaluations. Particularly challenging was the question of legal capacity. Many of the family's adults had significant cognitive deficiencies, but had developed adaptive survival skills within their restricted environment. Determining who could be legally held responsible for forced consanguinity practices and who should be considered a victim became a thin and complex line. After months of evaluations and judicial deliberations, an intermediate solution emerged. The youngest children under 12 years of age were placed in state custody with plans for eventual adoption or placement in foster homes. Teenagers were directed to special educational transition programs. Adults with severe cognitive deficiencies were referred to specialized care institutions. Only 5 adults were formally charged with crimes related to child abuse and promotion of incest, all older men who made up the so-called Council of Elders and who, according to testimonies from other members, were the main responsible for decreeing and forcing consanguineous marriages. Obadiah O'Leary, then 67 years old, was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 1965, although he served only 4 before dying in the Missouri State Penitentiary due to cardiac complications. His last testimonies preserved in court archives reveal a man unable to fully comprehend the criminal nature of his actions. "We only did what had always been done to keep the family strong and safe from the corrupt world out there." The Holloway property presented another dilemma. Legally, it belonged to Jeremiah's descendants, but determining the succession line became practically impossible due to the complexity of family ties and the absence of documentation. In 1967, the state of Missouri finally acquired the property through eminent domain process with the values deposited in a trust fund for the benefit of former family members. The lands were later incorporated into the Mark Twain National Forest, a pragmatic decision that also served to gradually erase the physical evidence of the isolated community. Today, few visitors to the forest know that walking certain trails they are passing through the almost invisible ruins of one of the most isolated and genetically closed communities in recent American history. For the whole children who were integrated into society, the transition was extraordinarily difficult. Many presented not only medical and cognitive challenges, but also profound cultural shock. Even after 5 years, some still manifest recurring nightmares about being taken by strangers, wrote social worker Deborah Winters, who accompanied several of the children for years, in her 1970 report. Concepts we consider basic, such as telephones, television, or even indoor bathrooms, were initially met with fear and distrust. The Holloway case exposed systemic failures in social and health services for isolated rural communities. In direct response, the state of Missouri established in 1966 the Rural Outreach Program specifically designed to identify and monitor families in remote areas, ensuring access to education, vaccination, and basic health services. 60 years have passed since the discovery of the Holloway family in the depths of the Ozark Mountains, but the ripples of that case continue to reverberate in medicine, in social policies, and more deeply in the lives of survivors and their descendants. Emma Holloway Patterson, who was only 5 years old when she was removed from the family property in 1964, is today one of the few former members who speaks openly about her experiences. Adopted by a family of teachers in Springfield, Missouri, Emma managed to overcome significant initial difficulties and eventually became a nurse, a professional choice she directly attributes to her personal history. For a long time, I tried to forget where I came from, Emma confided in a rare interview given in 2010 to the Missouri Historical Review. But I realized that my story, however painful it may be, contains important lessons about how communities can disappear from society's view and how children suffer when we allow that to happen. Of the 42 family members identified in 1964, follow-up records indicate that only 28 were alive in 1980 and fewer than 15 in 2000. The significantly reduced life expectancy, especially among those with more severe congenital anomalies, is a somber reminder of the lasting impact of extreme consanguinity. Timothy Holloway, the boy who underwent emergency cranial surgery, lived until the age of 32 in a specialized institution. His drawings, impressive visual representations of memories of life on the property, were later published in a special volume by the University of Missouri and are considered valuable anthropological documents. His works, with vibrant colors contrasting with often disturbing themes, present a unique perspective of life within the isolated community. Not all survivors found paths to adaptation. Records from the Missouri Department of Mental Health indicate that about 40% of adult family members who were institutionalized remained dependent on care for life. Others faced significant challenges of social integration even after years of therapy and educational support. The Holloway case taught us that extreme isolation combined with consanguinity produces not only genetic effects, but also profound psychological and social effects that can persist for generations, observes Michael Roberts, a retired social worker who worked with several family members for more than 2 decades. Some of those who seemed less physically affected were in fact the ones who struggled most to build normal relationships outside the distorted family structure in which they were raised. The medical impact of the case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The extensive genetic and medical records collected from the Holloway family, always with protected identities, became study material in medical schools. The Ozark cohort study begun in 1970 and continuing to this day follows not only the original survivors but also their descendants, documenting how the genetic effects of prolonged consanguinity manifest through subsequent generations. The data collected from the Holloway family has provided unique insights into more than 30 rare recessive conditions, explains Dr. Jennifer Lawson, a geneticist who has worked with the study since 1995. In a very real sense, their suffering contributed to significant advances in modern genetic counseling and prenatal diagnosis. In the legal and public policy realm, the case catalyzed important changes. Missouri's Rural Community Protection Act of 1967, directly inspired by the Holloway case, established protocols for regular monitoring of remote areas and educational verification requirements for all children regardless of distance from urban centers. Decades later, experts recognize that the legislation likely prevented similar situations. The original Holloway property, now part of the National Forest, became the subject of debate among historians and conservationists. In 2008, a proposal to designate the site as a historical landmark was rejected after intense discussions about the ethics of preserving a site associated with so much human suffering. Today, only a small informative plaque, discreet and easily ignored by visitors, vaguely mentions that the area was inhabited by an isolated community until the mid-10th century. The family cemetery, however, was preserved and restored in 2012 with simple headstones replacing the original rudimentary markings, a compromise between completely erasing history and respecting those who died there, many of whom were children who never knew any world beyond that isolated valley. For scholars of American social history, the Holloway Case remains an extreme but instructive example of how geographic isolation can interact with cultural beliefs to create social microcosms that radically diverge from the norms of the broader society. What makes the Holloway Case so significant is not just its extreme nature, but how it illustrates processes of cultural and genetic isolation that occurred on a smaller scale in many American rural regions, argues historian Dr. Catherine Henderson, author of Invisible Communities, Isolation and Identity in Rural America. The line between legitimate cultural autonomy and harmful isolation is often blurred, and the case invites us to examine that border more carefully. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of the case is its impact on public awareness of isolated communities. The Missouri Historical Society archives record a significant increase in reporting on forgotten populations in rural areas in the years following the discovery of the Holloways, a growing recognition that even in modern and connected America, there are pockets of isolation where people can fall through the cracks of social protection systems. The lessons of the Holloway Case remain relevant today in a world where geographic inequalities in access to services continue to shape lives. As Emma O'Leary Patterson noted in her final testimony, the distance that separated our family from the world wasn't just in miles.